So areas of focus: performance, efficiency, planning for growth. Everyone we work for, everyone's wants their business to be successful. Generally, if you're running services within Azure and your company's growing as an IT, as a person responsible for the IT infrastructure, that will usually increase. It won't be across absolutely everything. There'll be certain areas that will need more resources. Will need to be made more available, more efficient, kind of moving forward. Understand the growth plans that relate to the business, and set goals around the infrastructure for that. Look at building the capacity plans, so understanding as you grow and increase that those resources around those different applications. Are you going to meet capacity? Sort of, are you going to hit a glass ceiling with some of the things that you're looking to grow? Is there a restriction through the application? Is there a restriction with the way that environment is being deployed? These are things that you need to think about. Being able to scale to meet demand, so it doesn't have to be not so much you're planning for your first year, really looking at that long-term growth and steady growth, but scaling to meet demand. If you've got work in a specific industry that that's affected by things like if you're in retail, Black Friday, if you're within the travel industry, certain periods of the year are much busier. Can you scale to meet those on demand when it happens? In terms of where you deploy, selecting regions that are closest to your users seems quite simple, but it's amazing how many people that we speak to that have an application that's very successful in one region and look to try and push that out to other regions without kind of moving and considering the impact it's having on the end users and kind of wondering why they're not getting traction in those new regions. And then monitor your performance. Putting all these things in place, the scaling, the kind of performance of the different applications. If you're not looking at that and getting direct feedback, do you know if your plans are having the effect that you want them to have? So if you're monitoring, start setting performance goals. So these will be specific to your business. Identify those key metrics. It could be how many simultaneous users you have on a web page. How long does it take for that page to load? How quickly does an API respond? What's the maximum number of transactions that my application can take? So that would be specific to your business, specific to the applications that you're looking at. And as we said, you need to be monitoring those to know that whether you're hitting those goals or not. In terms of monitoring, don't just take average kind of sort of figures for different things that you're monitoring. Look across that. If you've got outliers, you can kind of skew that information one way or the other to try to get as accurate numbers back as possible. So creating a health model, we'll talk about this a little bit more in some of the operational efficiency. What does a healthy what does your infrastructure look like when it is when it's healthy, when it's working well? What happens when it gets impacted by application issues or resources fail? What happens with those? Can you distinguish between transient and non-transient faults? Are you able to identify upper limits for scaling? So there's upper limits within the individual service you use within Azure, but it might also be an impact on the application that you're looking to scale as well. So you've planned, you've set your goals, you're measuring against those goals. The next step is to then start forecasting for future growth. And the elements we really need to be looking at here, understanding your workloads well, so understanding how they react under failure, how they understand scaling up and scaling down. the monitoring that you've been doing, you've got access now to historical data, so you might be able to do, preemptive scaling. So we mentioned, things like retail, Cyber Monday. There's no point waiting until 1 minute past midnight when everyone's hitting those websites to be scaling up to meet that demand. Scale up ahead of time to make sure that you can, you're not ending up with customers and people that are wanting to spend money not being able to get access to those websites and get access to those deals. So the impact of world events. So this doesn't have to be something, like COVID is obviously a huge one. Obviously everyone's had to react to that over the last few years, but there could be a political event, there could be economic events, there could be it could be something simple, working in the travel industry and being affected by weather and kind of holiday periods and that kind of thing. So yeah, understanding what are the outside influences that can have an impact on your services that you're putting out there, and whether you're going to see a spike or even a reduction. Impact of marketing initiatives. Marketing, in every company is trying to drive business towards websites, drive people into shops, drive people into spending money through the market initiatives that they do. So if there's one going out there, make sure you're in contact with your marketing team and understanding if they're sending out something where everyone gets 25% off, and it's driving a lot of extra traffic to your applications, that they're ready for that. So again, scaling up ahead of those those events is kind of what you're needing to do from a forecasting point of view. Forecasting can only be done when you've got that data in place, and if you can do that, if you can forecast correctly, the next sort of step, or perhaps one of the final steps you want to do, is perhaps looking at doing benchmarking. Compare yourselves to others in your industry, looking at other people that have got similar environments and similar infrastructure as yours, and kind of how they're doing and what they're doing, and you can get help from that through Microsoft, or through partners that have obviously got experience of other customers and what they're doing. So one of the common things that gets spoken about is auto scaling with cloud. So just thought it'd be worth just to jump in and talk about that a little bit. So there's two types of auto scaling. There's vertical scaling, scaling up and down, and there's horizontal scaling. It's also called scaling in and out. Vertical scaling is upgrading things like CPU, adding more memory, scaling that individual unit that makes up part of your infrastructure and making it able to do more work. When you change that capacity of the resource, moving perhaps to a larger VM size or something like that, although you can do that on the fly, you may end up with your application can't cope with that, and you may end up with the system being temporarily unavailable. That's why we don't see that often when it comes to automating that vertical scaling. It's more done as a kind of point in time manual process. Horizontal scaling, though, however, this is something that's used throughout Azure. You're adding individual instances, and in the graphic there, we're showing what is the minimum amount of resources that I want available at any one time, and then we're giving it a high end there. So we're saying that we always want 2 of these virtual machines running to be able to provide these services. We don't want to go beyond 5, because this is where we're getting the balance between our performance efficiency and our cost, taking the 2 different pillars and finding that balance. The big thing to consider here is your application. So not all applications can scale in this way. You want to test this. You want to see whether, when you scale out, what's the experience of the end user. If I'm working on VM3 and the overall kind of resource demand drops, is it going to drop me off of that VM? Am I going to lose my session? When it scales up, do I get an error that I then have to go back in before I can pick up that new VM that's spun up? So when it comes to scaling, you need to sort of think about what you're doing and plan for it. The strategy will generally involve a few different things. So instrumentation and monitoring of the application and the infrastructure, also understanding key metrics such as response times, queue lengths, CPU utilization, and memory usage. All of these are key indicators of how busy your system is, and can be used then to leverage this information and use some sort of decision-making logic to then decide what to spin up or what to spin down through predefined thresholds that you set. On top of that, testing, monitoring, tuning and auto scaling is something that you would do to ensure that it keeps functioning as you expect it to. So like we said, monitoring will be not just looking, on your dashboards and seeing how it's performing, but actually getting an understanding of what that looks like from a user point of view. As your monitor, auto scale is kind of the tool that's available for this. So you can auto scale not just sort of virtual machine scale sets, which is kind of the graphic that we're looking at here, but you can do it within the app service. There's existing services out there that has services that use this functionality. So AVD is a common one. You can have like a single server that's kind of up. So if someone's coming on to use VDI at 2 in the morning when there's hardly anyone there, there's already a service sitting there waiting. And then it will scale up to meet demands during the working day. The majority of users are on there. But again, monitor, understand what your auto scaling looks like. So you use 10 instances on a weekday, but only 4 over the weekend. These sorts of things are important to understand. What happens when we do scale up and scale down? What's that user experience? And what does that profile look like for me and for my application? So in terms of the design of the infrastructure and the applications that you're running, here you're looking to design for performance. So I feel like I've been through this slide already. Sorry, this might be a problem with my slides here. Yeah, I think there is. Essentially, it's a long slide. This slide was really supposed to be here to show you kind of some of the additional things you can do around designing, for performance. So we might be looking at things like separating data into different types of storage. It could be looking at things like sharding or partitioning of data and multiple databases. Having that partitioning strategy, going ahead as you scale up, data is probably the hardest part of any kind of infrastructure to scale. So if you're not using a PaaS service, how does your application react to, creating more database servers? Is that going to work? And kind of understanding whether that's going to be a restriction on how you can go about scaling out these servers. Some of the other things you need to look at and understand, and there's lots of documentation which is really helpful around things around anti-patterns. So, things that you shouldn't do. Session affinity is a big one. So if you are have a requirement for your application that someone has to, be on a specific VM, for example, to be able to get the functionality that they need, that really limits your ability to scale out. So if it's a e-commerce application or website, if someone needs to be on a specific VM to finish that transaction. What happens if they walk away from their desk and decide, oh, I'll go and get that later, it's in my basket, but I'll look at buying that later. If it requires session affinity, that limits your ability to switch off that VM without losing that sale or giving the customer a bad experience. Another anti-pattern that you want to avoid is a busy user interface. If your application calls for long-running CPU-intensive processes on that user interface as part of that application, try and push that off to an application layer, or try and push that off to some background services. The last thing you want to be doing is sitting on a website, staring at the same page, waiting for something to happen. If you've got busy data, so that anti-pattern really refers to trying to process everything live within that data, within your actual data store. Databases, as we said, typically they don't scale that well in terms of scaling out, and that can become a bottleneck as well. To start trying to move that logic to a different part of your application. In terms of good design practices, caching, is one. Certainly for tools like Redis cache that you've got available within the Azure services. If you've got lots of static web content as part of your application and your web front end, look to utilize a CDN. So there's third-party services as well as Microsoft ones within there as well. And certainly if your application is global, consider that caching, not only just for better experience for customers, but it also can provide redundancy as well. So we mentioned transient and non-transient errors. I don't think we covered that before, but really these are the key thing for your applications to be able to define, not just for kind of the performance efficiency, but also looking at reliability as well. And we're going to go into that. Non-transient error, these are good errors, the errors that continue as long as they haven't been corrected. Transient errors are ones that you need to that happen and come and go, and perhaps you won't find a solution for, but you just need to be aware of them and make sure that they don't spend too much time trying to fix those things that can't be fixed.